Everyone is literally going through Lantern right now, but I still want to talk about Nod Krai. Yes, I'm late, but let's still talk about it. Nod Krai was the region that I personally didn't really look forward to, mainly because for the past 5 years, I've been really excited to go to Snezhnaya, but I was actually very surprised at just how much I liked the story in Nod Krai. I think Nod Krai is often considered as a filler because it delayed the most anticipated region in the game, but I think they managed to pull it off by making an interesting set of new characters, bringing on the most anticipated characters in the past 5 years into the spotlight, and of course the change in how they portrayed the Traveler. Before we start, as usual, disclaimer, this video is just my opinion based on my own personal experience playing through the game. I'm not here to give you a professional video essay. I'm just here to yap and talk about the game that I've loved since the beginning. So if you're looking for something more structured and professional and have like some in-depth analysis, maybe this isn't the right video for you. But if you want something more casual, then stick around. Okay, so the Archon quest. How do we actually feel about the Archon quest? We have a whopping 8 separate acts this time. Now, personally, I don't mind it at all because there's a lot to cover. Even in 8 acts, I think the game tried to do a bit too much. Don't get me wrong, the pacing is not as bad as Inazuma's, but they had to cover a lot in Nod Krai. First of all, unlike all of the other regions, there were really no crumbs about Nod Krai for the past 5 years. Or maybe I just missed some, or it just went over my head, I don't know. But I think most players just didn't really know what to expect until like a few weeks, a few months before we got there. There were no hints about Archons to look forward to, or mentions in trailers like as early as patch 1.0. So Genshin really had to establish an entire region, its characters, and its lore in the main quest. For example, we've been drip-fed lore about Snezhnaya, its characters, and what it's like over there since the beginning of the game. So as players, we already know what to expect when we eventually get there. We know that the story would revolve around the Fatui, the Tsaritsa. Obviously, we don't know everything that's going on over there, but it's not a complete blank slate. Nod Krai had to use its first 2 acts to establish the main characters of the story, the 5 stars, and also the different factions at play when the Traveler actually arrives in Nod Krai. There's the Fatui, the Frostmoon Scions, and the Lightkeepers. There's also Nefer, and Ineffa, and Aino, and there's Varka. There's a lot here. So for instance, the main story had to spend time with Lauma so we can get a better understanding of who the Frostmoon Scions are and how they're related to the main story about the 3 Moon Sisters. Speaking of which, establishing the 3 Moon Sisters storyline is already a challenge in itself. Chances are, if you're a casual player and don't really pay attention to the like deep lore, or you read about the Moon Sisters years ago and you've just forgotten it and you need a refresher, the game had to re-establish that in the main story so that everyone would just know what's going on. And then they needed to do a similar introduction to integrate Flynn's and the Wild Hunt because it's related to the main villain of the first half of the story, which is Rerir. And then they had to tie in Columbina because, well, she's the moon goddess, and in a way she does get a little bit of the Archon treatment in Nod Krai, like at least storytelling wise. Obviously she's not an Archon, but her importance in the Nod Krai quests are quite similar and is kind of central the same way the Archons are in their respective regions. So it is very crucial that the Traveler and players spend a significant amount of time with Columbina. Other than that, I would say the easiest faction to establish within the story is the Fatui, purely because we already know so much about them. Hence why they just introduced the Fatui's involvement in Nod Krai mainly through a few NPCs that didn't really last for too long, and then of course through Sandrone. So that's what they did in Act 1 and 2, mostly introductions of the characters and the region. So it does feel like it's a little bit slow, but it's expected really. There's a lot of groundwork that needs to be covered for future acts. 3 and 4 was a bit of a change in pace for me. I feel like it was where the story really started to have its hook, mostly because by this time I'm acquainted with the Nod Krai characters. And not gonna lie, even though it was very long, I really enjoyed the segment where Nefer went into Rerir's past. It was just mwah. Genshin really tried its best to show and not just tell the players what was going on way back then in Conria, and I think they did a really good job in showing Rerir's backstory in a compelling way. Now, I do wish they had some options to pause in between quests. I don't know why they chose to basically lock players in the game for like 5 to 6 hours. There are the occasional save points, but I think a middle cutoff where players can have that break in between intense storylines is still feel ideal. Anyway, by this point, I really enjoyed just having Rarier as the main villain. I think he was really well established. We can see the descent of someone who is fairly human and normal, just your average guy, who is revealed to be a complete monster simply by ignorance, and then we just get to see him in his downfall into the abyss. I really liked how the game was building him up as a villain and as a threat to the main characters of the story. But then as we get into the later acts, I personally think they started to do too much by having two essentially like separate villains. So what happens is that they needed to wrap up the Rarier stuff by Act 4, and at first I thought it was more of a pause thing on Rarier. So when the pace slowed down for a bit and it started focusing on Columbina's journey back to the moon and just hanging out with the people of Nod Krai, I didn't really mind it as much. But then the focus just fully shifted to Dottore, and because Dottore is such a menace to the story, we also had multiple other characters being brought into the quest. At this point, there's Arlecchino, the Wanderer, Durin, Varkan, Nicole, Albedo, and obviously the entire Nod Krai cast that was introduced earlier. There's also technically the three Moon Sisters that Columbina meets. There's Columbina herself. It is a packed cast. And I do think they did a pretty good job in making sure that all of these characters get their moment to shine because of how the game tried their best in establishing Lauma, Flynn's, and especially Nefer's role into the story. Their presence in the later acts also feel very organic. It just felt natural that all three of them were present with the Traveler in the final fight against Dottore, and I do think that moment was properly built up, so it was well earned. However, while I do think Act 7 and 8 was a satisfying conclusion to Nod Krai, I do think that they just tried to do too much, that some moments felt a little bit underdeveloped or lackluster. So I will talk about characters later on, but Rarier's conclusion and how he just came to change his mind off screen, and then the reveal of his and Thalindis' fate, that was a bit of a letdown for me. Not because he changed his mind, but because it was done off screen. Dottore's motivations in mind swapping animals and humans is also pretty underdeveloped. But again, this mostly comes from having two villains to focus on instead of just one. And they're not like small, insignificant villains, you know? They're not NPCs. Well, technically, Rarier is an NPC, but they're not throwaway characters. Rarier is one of the 5 sinners, and Dottore has been in the game since before the game was launched. He was in the webtoon. He was a villain since the very beginning. These are important villain characters. That's why I'm surprised that they tried to cram both of them into the same storyline. Anyway, enough about villains. The core cast actually got solid development throughout the quests. Even Sandrone had small interactive moments while she was doing her part. We even get to play as Polonia, which seems mundane, but I actually really enjoyed this part of the quest. Maybe it's just because I like Polonia for whatever reason, but personally for me, those little moments add attachment to these characters. There's also an entire investigative segment with the iconic trio of Albedo, Durin, and Hat Guy. They were also integrated into the story pretty well. They were a fun presence in the story. I also saw some people say that the story ended up being another power of friendship moment at the end, but I don't really think that's the case. Honestly, guys, I think Sumeru was more on the nose about using the power of friendship. In Nod Krai, Columbina and the other Nod Krai characters were motivated by the love of their friends, but it's not like they saved the day magically through the power of friendship. Friendship was just another motivation that helped them push through their own hardships. So it's not as bad as some people are making it out to be. So I do think the Archon quest was pretty solid. Like, it did a good job with its characters. It kind of dropped the ball on the villains, but it did a wonderful job with the Traveler, which I will talk about later on. But overall, the main quest, I enjoyed it a lot, had a ton of fun playing through it, which is usually all I could ask for when playing a video game. I just want to have fun. I just want to have a good time. Okay, the characters. I think Nod Krai did a fairly good job with their characters, considering there were a lot of them. They did a good job in integrating their new characters with the older characters that were brought back, but there are a few characters that stood out to me. I'm not gonna talk about every character that was present in the story, and that's not because I didn't enjoy their portrayal or them as characters. I've enjoyed most of the characters introduced, but there are ones that I want to talk about more than others. Columbina, where do I start with Columbina? I think people get really riled up when talking about her. her and for different reasons. Some are just so disappointed that she didn't live up to the fanon interpretation of her being this scary angelic being that she seemed to be in A Winter's Night's Lazo, and some just don't like seeing her criticized at all. Honestly, both are kind of funny to me. I'm personally completely fine with the Columbina that we got. Was she different from the one I initially expected over 3 years ago? Yes, but I like this version just fine too. Although I would say the amount of times she sighed is kind of obscene. It just started to bother me at one point, but that is a very specific nitpick of mine. I will say though, I understand how some people can be disappointed with this version of Columbina because she's been so highly anticipated for such a long time. So is it okay to be disappointed? Yes, but is it okay to ridicule other people who enjoy her character as she's currently written? No. Why would you do that? Listen, I make Genshin videos as a hobby. I've talked about so many characters, and there are some characters that I just don't like and have openly criticized. But I will never ridicule other people for enjoying them as they are. If you enjoy a character purely because you like them, then more power to you. Just because you and I might not enjoy the same character doesn't mean I have the right to act all superior. We just have different tastes. But anyway, rant aside, character-wise, I think she's also written pretty okay. I don't think that she's as bad as some people make her out to be. She's the reincarnation of the Frost Moon goddess, and because she technically comes from the moon, Columbina has always felt like she didn't belong anywhere in Teyvat. When she was worshipped by the Frost Moon Scions, she felt like the people only accepted her for what she could give them. She has always been expected to give something to other people. No one had really accepted her as a person. Even in the Fatui, she was there because the Tsaritsa needed her powers. And as soon as she was done and had nothing left to give, Columbina immediately felt like she no longer belonged there. She moves through Teyvat like a nomad, and I think this part of her character is pretty well written when you take into consideration that the Frost Moon, which is technically where she originated from, is separated from Teyvat by the false sky. So not only is she in a weakened state because of the fake sky, but she's also quite literally isolated in a land that isn't home to her. And I think her desire for belonging is something very human. She's given a lot of time in the later parts of the Nod Krai quest to establish her role as the new moon goddess or the tri-lune goddess. It was later revealed that she traveled to the past, to the time when the original 3 moon goddesses were imprisoned by Nibelung, and there she made the decision to resurrect herself much later on, which is in present day, and she did so by splitting her being into 3 parts. Her body was turned into Kuvaki and poured all over Nod Krai. That's why Kuvaki is exclusive to Nod Krai. Her soul was left inside the moon's reflection with Luonatar as its anchor on Teyvat, and her authority as the Tri-Lune goddess was hidden within the Frost Moon. And just by that botched description, you can already tell that they tried to do a lot with Columbina, and I think they handled her character as it is written pretty well. However, I do think there are just some missed potential with Columbina, and that is not to say that she is a bad character. I'm just saying there are some potentials that weren't met, which is true for most of Genshin characters, if not all. And that is literally just her role as a harbinger and her connection to the Fatui. She was with the Fatui for a long time, and even if she's never really dispatched on missions or were heavily involved in their shady shenanigans, I think it would have been interesting to see how Columbina feels about that side of the Fatui. The Fatui aren't good people, and Columbina was a part of that organization. She didn't feel fully at home with them, sure, but she stayed long enough for her to be able to complete whatever the Tsaritsa needed from her. It would have been really interesting to see what the title of Harbinger meant to her and how she justifies the actions of the Fatui. Like, her friends, her co-workers like Sandrone and Arlecchino are very shady people. Like, does she care or does she agree with what the Tsaritsa is doing? How does she feel about her fellow Harbingers ripping other people's tongues off? Or how most of them are very comfortable with murder? In terms of morality, we only know that she doesn't like Dottore, but is that because she disagrees with his actions, or is it only because it affects her and the people that she personally cares about? Her character story actually touched a bit on her dynamic with Dottore. And in the beginning, Dottore was nice to her, like he would compliment her and she would feel fulfilled by that because she felt validated and felt useful. And that is the thing with Columbina. She ties her self-worth to what she can give to others. But when Dottore started to say things like not quite enough, or you can do better, or you're capable of more, suddenly Columbina saw what Dottore was actually doing to her and that he wasn't interested in her as a person, but more on what she could give him, which is unfortunately something that she's very familiar with. She just feels like no one is really seeing her or her. And this character's story is actually consistent with what we see in the Nod Krai quests. I think exploring the more gray parts of Columbina would have added a lot to her as a character. It would make her an even more interesting character because she's actually already very interesting. So I completely disagree that she has to be canon Columbina to be interesting. I also don't really agree with the comments that say she's just another addition to the long list of traveler waifus, or she's just a damsel in distress character that adds no value at all to the story. I think that's just not true. Columbina has a lot of potential to be complex, but it's just not fully utilized by the game. But that doesn't mean she doesn't have impactful character moments in the game. That whole arc where she went back in time through the moon's reflection and leaving behind clues for her friends and then making a decision to split her being into 3 parts. All of those things are probably the farthest thing from the damsel in distress trope. She showed agency, bravery, and resilience. She has a softer and more demure personality, sure, and she sees the best in people, but those things don't make her helpless. That is just one part of her personality. She also genuinely wants to help the traveler. I really like that scene of them just gazing at Teyvat from the moon. It shows just how far we've come in the story, and it also happens to remind me of another scene from another game franchise that I love, The Traveler. I think they improved the Traveler's writing so much in Nod Krai. Listen, I'm not saying they're automatically the best protagonists of a video game, but they're miles away from how they were portrayed in earlier regions, okay? They spoke so much. They probably spoke more in Nod Krai than they did in the first 3 regions combined. They actually have choices that directly impacted how the story flowed. For example, something as tiny as the Traveler deciding to not share their suspicions on Flints with Nefer in Act 2 shows that the Traveler isn't just mindlessly interacting with whatever character they come across. They chose to trust some characters more than others, and they withhold information to some characters as well. They are starting to act like any other human would, and the game is showing that they are capable of judging another person's character. I mean, we've always had access to the Traveler's thoughts, but now that it's accompanied with real dialogue and real on-screen portrayal of relationship dynamics with other characters, I think it just makes the Traveler an even better character. They have always had agency. Like, remember back in Inazuma, the Traveler rejected Ayaka's plea for help with the Vision Hunt decree, but because there was no dialogue, I feel like the impact of that decision isn't as strong to the story, especially since they also changed their mind in the same quest. Anyway, back to Nod Krai. I do want to talk about the Traveler scene with Dottore. I will not stop glazing this scene, okay? And it's not because the Traveler is shown to have a darker side or whatever. You can think that this scene is cringe, but I personally love how we got a protagonist versus antagonist moment between the Traveler and Dottore. This encounter between the two of them was never about who was the strongest and who could overpower the other. It is purely a clash of ideals and a clash on how both characters see the world around them. The Traveler has mostly been silent in their journey in Teyvat, so while we do have some voice lines, a lot of their personality traits aren't really showcased on screen, hence why the Traveler can feel very hollow or stiff as a character. Because without that knowledge into their inner world being woven into the story, there's no room for any clash of ideologies between characters. That is why in some big fights, the Traveler can just feel like a shell that's there to participate, even if that moment was cool or meant to be the climax of the story. What happened with Dottore was anything but that. Dottore directly tries to appeal to the Traveler's inner world. Dottore knows what the Traveler wants most, and he tries his best to exploit that. He tried to undermine what the people of Teyvat meant to the Traveler, but we as the players have seen countless moments where the Traveler has spent bonding, connecting with the people of Teyvat, people in Mondstadt, Liyue, Sumeru, Fontaine, and Natlan, and now Nod Krai. While the Traveler have been roped into a lot of conflict that that they never really wanted to be a part of, is still someone with a heart big enough to care about others. The traveler cared about the minority of people who had their visions taken away in Inazuma. They cared about the people of Fontaine drowning. They cared about Nahida being held captive. Sure, their main goal in traveling through Teyvat is to get to their twin, but they have gone out of their way to help others. Hell, they've even grown to care about the Wanderer, someone who has tried to kill them multiple times, and is sometimes still kind of an asshole to the traveler. But their relationship with other characters grew over time, and they've become important to the traveler. And now the traveler cares for Columbina, someone who they see is in need of help. The traveler is shown from time and time again to be a character that greatly cares for family. In fact, they point out this directly. They don't crave friends, they only crave family. But I guess for me, what they did in Nod Krai with the traveler is to show that even though the traveler had lost their only family, they have also found themselves a gigantic found family in Teyvat. It makes them feel less alone even when they're a descender on a strange planet. And I believe them when they say to Columbina that they feel like Teyvat is home to them. It's a place that's now filled with connections and memories that are probably irreplaceable to the traveler. So it's not just about how they spoke more or how they got cooler moments in the story, it's how those moments are finally impacting them as a character. But I do agree that this balanced approach of both hero and witness is what makes them the most compelling protagonists so far in Nod Krai. There are moments in the Nod Krai quest that they just took a back seat and let the other characters run the show, but again, they also got really important moments where they shined the most. There were entire segments where it was just Nefer and Columbina who are moving the plot forward and the traveler is just there chilling. But then they also get the scene with Dottore and massive character development. So in my personal opinion, they definitely nailed the balance of witness and hero for the traveler in Nod Krai. Okay, so I've been wanting to talk about Rerir because he is kind of the villain that I just didn't expect from Genshin. I genuinely did not expect for Genshin to even attempt to make a complex villain, other than probably Dottore. Especially one that isn't gonna be playable. Let's be honest, I don't think they put this much effort in their 5 stars. So I was very surprised to see that Rerir not only got a backstory, but also an established relationship dynamic with multiple characters. Obviously, the main one is Talindis. She's the woman he wants to marry and live a normal life with. But we also get glimpses of his interactions with other Conrians like Dainsleif and his brother Vidovolnir. Rerir's life back in Conria is anything but normal. He's basically the undercover executioner tasked to eliminate anyone related to the Crimson Moon Dynasty, and the game goes out of its way to establish that Rerir's actions weren't motivated by any ideologies that he himself believed in. Rerir did the horrendous things that he did because he was just indifferent to it. Ending the lives of so many innocent people, a lot of which are children, didn't really bother him because to him, it's just a job. He was given orders by the king, and he did what he did because it felt like, well, a task given to him. Did he know it was morally wrong? Yes, I would say so. If he didn't know to an extent that what he was doing was wrong, he wouldn't have hidden it from Talindis. He knows the nature of his job is sinister, yet the scariest thing about Rerir is just how indifferent he is to the harm that he's causing until it directly affects him. The story reveals that Talindis is someone related to the Crimson Moon Dynasty. She's not directly related, but she does carry a bloodline from some distant relative, I guess. But this was enough to put a target on her back. This act of only caring once it directly affects you is, I think, a really good theme to be given to a villain because of just how common it is in the real world. I think Rerir works as a villain because his motivations are humanly real. If you think about all of the horrible things that has been happening in the world, a lot of it is enabled by people like Rerir. Not cartoonishly evil monsters with grand ambitions, but by humans who didn't really care enough. Rerir is inherently selfish. Even until the end, Rerir made it very clear to the players that the only reason he's storming the Vinster King's palace is not to help Dainsleif or to help a friend. It's so that he can bargain with the king for pardon. He just wants to live a normal life with Talindis. Again, completely acting in self-interest. He even directly says that he's not interested in helping other people or saving the world. He really just just wants a normal life with the woman that he loves. And that is a very human motivation to have, in my opinion. Also, it makes him an even more compelling character to me because he's also a hypocrite. A lot of people whose lives ended by his hands also just wanted a normal life. Most of them aren't even interested in restoring the old dynasty, and some aren't even aware that they're a part of this ancient bloodline. They were just living their lives normally, and Rere took that away from them all because he couldn't care enough. And yet here he is trying, begging for the same life that he took away from so many others. Thelindis eventually thought that Rere was sent to kill her after she figured out his actual job, and in their final confrontation, she threw herself into the moon's reflection because I guess she thought that it was the only solution that would help Rere live a normal life, despite him already actively protesting in that moment. And this led him down to the path of the abyss, and that's how he became one of the 5 sinners of Khaenri'ah. And it is also the reason why he's so obsessed with the 3 moons, because centuries later, which is when he met the Traveler, he is still looking for Thelindis. It makes him both a monster and human, despicable yet understandable. I really liked how they set him up. So imagine my immense disappointment when he was just defeated in one act. The Rere conflict actually ended in Act 4, literally halfway through Nod Krai. It is just a disappointment considering he is the first 5 sinners that we officially meet. I get that Columbina and literally everyone else involved are also powerful, but how the game handled Rere's defeat just reminded me of how Genshin's storytelling currently still lacks consequences for the characters. Everyone came out of fighting one of the individuals responsible for the infamous cataclysm pretty much unscathed. Is it expected from Genshin? Yes, but it's also still disappointing to me, especially because of how good his build-up was. And then it got worse when we see him later on. Columbina actually meets Rere when she was in the moon's reflection, and he just seemed like a completely different person from where we last saw him. The thing is, I am not bothered by Rere's attitude changing completely. I'm bothered by the fact that it happened off screen. I get that they can't stuff everything into the Archon quest, but this is the opposite of how they handled his development and introduction. We were shown almost everything that ensured he was a nuanced character, and yet the game somehow couldn't be bothered in doing that for his resolution. The game just tells you he has self-reflected and is now doomed to just be a few steps away from Thelindis, but she will forever be unreachable to him. A tragic ending for sure, but how they handled his resolution as a villain and as a character is the real tragedy here. Sandrone. I think she's the fan favorite in Nod Krai. I mean, I've always liked her design, but I didn't expect to like her this much. Coming into Nod Krai, I think everyone knew her as the Harbinger who created Catherine and not much else. But Sandrone is the creation of Alain Guillotin. Guys, I can't pronounce French names, okay? I'm so sorry. A name that will be very familiar if you've played through the very important questline in Fontaine. She was created with the face of Alain's late sister who died tragically a long time ago. I'm not gonna recap the entire questline here, but I do think having some knowledge about the questline does heavily impact Sandrone as a character. But based on the Nod Krai quest alone, Sandrone is portrayed as a very unpleasant harbinger. She's very proud and is pretty ruthless, but even from the very beginning, she was always willing to at least cooperate with others, so she's not malicious or out to hurt others for the fun of it. She's definitely a classic tsundere trope, but her being a trope isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think Sandrone is a fun character to follow. She's definitely one of the most entertaining ones in Nod Krai, although like most of the other harbingers, it seems like people were kind of thrown off with how not evil she is. But to be fair to Sandrone, she's one of the harbingers that we had the least information about. We know bits and pieces from voice lines, but there wasn't really anything concrete about her as a person. We do know that Sandrone is very cruel though. In that one world quest in Fontaine, she actually ripped someone's tongue off as punishment. And I don't agree that just because she's not as cruel in Nod Krai, it automatically ruins her as a character. I think they did a pretty good job in making her unpleasant but still pretty charming as a character. Personally for me, Sandrone is just a character that only cares for her research research and her machines. But once she does start caring about other people, she does seem genuine. Like she has no hidden agenda in being friends with Columbina other than enjoying her company despite what she outwardly says about her. Other than that, she's actually pretty cruel and kind of awful. I mean, the Fatui Harbingers aren't exactly the best group of people, so why would Sandrone, someone who is very proud, treat all of the egomaniacs that she works with as friends? She treats Columbina well because she's nice, at least. I can see Sandrone caring for others, especially people who aren't awful like Columbina and Arlecchino, who mostly mind their own business. And you can see through the Nod Krai quest that she can grow to care for others, a concept that Dottore, funnily enough, has a hard time comprehending, which is why he just said it was uncharacteristic of her to care about anything other than her machines. However, at the end of Act 8, Arlecchino gives us the item Marionette's Notebook, and this time it does fill in some of the blanks for Sandrone as a character. It is a log that briefly describes her early life and how slowly she learned simple emotions and having a harder time learning more complex ones like guilt. It detailed her growth and how she developed a sense of agency and curiosity. One thing that stood out to me is actually the conversation between Alan and Sandrone that's logged onto there, and it's about how her creator once had the dream to save the world, and Sandrone specifically asked her creator if this wish to save the world was something that he had wished she would inherit, and she was surprised when her creator said no. He said that Sandrone can do anything she liked and that he had no expectations, and he even asked her if she had any desires or ambitions of her own, to which she had no answer to. This is a personal interpretation, but I think Sandrone carried this wish of her creator subconsciously. Like, that's why in the Nod Krai quest, she was so willing to stop Dottore and even throw away her own life. Sure, you can believe that she wanted to help her friends, but that to me is an oversimplification of who she is as a character, especially now that we have this notebook. To me, she inherited her creator's savior complex because it just made sense for her as a character, and her creator clearly meant a great deal to her, almost like a parental figure. And a parental figure having that kind of impact on their child, mechanical or not, is just something that's expected. The rest of the log talks about her days after her creator's passing and her days in the Fatui. You can see her slowly developing the unpleasant personality that we've grown to love through her entries. You can see her initial annoyance at Columbina and Arlecchino, and her disapproval of Dottore, her awkward processing of her complex emotions like grief. I think this journal was such an interesting addition of her as a character, and while making this video, I have seen so many posts about how she's gonna come back since Arlecchino's going back to Fontaine to return her and Polonia's core, and I'm personally fine either way. Having her just be not alive can also act as a consequence for what happened in the story. Dottore is a powerful enemy, and in Genshin story, casualties or consequences aren't always present or presented well, so having one that's actually impactful, like killing off a character that is very well liked, can have strong narrative impact. But I'm also not a fan of how Genshin has killed off most of their harbingers because they're all pretty lackluster. I think they handled Sandrone's unaliving the best out of all of them, but I still don't like the fact that she was mostly established by one quest item that we got. It feels like we're only getting to know her as a character and that she still has a lot more to offer to the story, but it was just cut short, which is actually how I also feel about both Signora and Capitano. So if she is gonna come back, I'll be pretty happy about it. Now guys, how do you feel about Dottore? I personally find him very entertaining in this quest specifically. Like before Nod Krai, he was fun, but he was almost like the cackling evil villain except for that one conversation that he had with Nahida, and I guess all of the lore about him that's scattered all over Teyvat. But Nod Krai Dottore though, I think he knows exactly how to challenge the traveler's ideals. That's why again, I really like their entire sequence together. He actually felt like this calculating genius who knew exactly where to push the traveler's buttons. There's a reason why he keeps bringing up their twin and how helping people all over Teyvat hasn't necessarily aided them in their goals. goal. He knows how to appeal to the traveler's inner world. It makes him very compelling to me as a villain. He tries over and over again to sell the traveler the answers to all of their problems, in hopes that the traveler's desperation would take over and they would forget all of the strings that would be attached when you side with someone like Dottore. Dottore is someone who capitalizes on desperation. For example, he offers to cure children suffering from Elazar in Sumeru, a well-known deadly and incurable disease. He's knowingly targeting vulnerable and desperate people because he knows they're easier to control. But the one thing that Dottore is incapable of understanding despite his genius is obviously the bond that people have with each other, which is why he failed to convince the traveler. He was banking that the traveler's status as a descender would mean that they were isolated from other people in Teyvat, that they were an outsider and therefore they wouldn't put Teyvat above their own goal of finding their sibling. But this is where he was obviously wrong. The Nod Krai Archon Quest's theme is the exploration of friendship and the bonds that we form with the people who are different from us. It's how the right people would accept us for who we really are without demanding anything in return. He sees relationships as purely transactional, a give and take, and in this case, he has something to give to the traveler, while the others don't. And obviously, he greatly misunderstood the traveler because this is just something, or probably the only thing that he's incapable of understanding. So his constant traveler glazing is actually a miscalculation on his part, and I like that he had a miscalculation because Dottore is supposed to be this hyper-intelligent villain, and that is incredibly hard to write, especially in a video game like Genshin. He sees right through the protagonist's plan purely because he's intelligent, but it's not to the point that it becomes absurd. Like if you've watched Bleach, think of Aizen, where everything was always just a part of his plan. Also, he committed the ultimate sin of killing off Sandrone, so there's that, but considering how morally bankrupt he is, it is not out of character at all. So I actually really like both of the villains given to us in Nod Krai. I really like Rairer because he's just so well established, and also Dottore, someone who's basically the opposite of Rairer. His motivations are literally the opposite of I just want to live a normal life. So it does create an interesting narrative in the Nod Krai storyline. However, I do think that even with 8 whole acts, it still feels a bit cramped, especially with 2 villains who are on opposite spectrums. Not to mention, both villains are a part of very important factions. One is a Fatui Harbinger and one is a Sinner of Khandria. I feel like both Dottore and Rairer got the short end of the stick, Rairer having his conclusion pretty much entirely off screen, while Dottore had very little establishment in Nod Krai itself. Yes, there's some foreshadowing and we've known Dottore for a while now, but story-wise, I think it would have been better if the Nod Krai quest had just focused on either Rairer or Dottore. Dottore's complexities as a villain could have been further established too, probably to the same level as Rairer's backstory if the game had just more time and focus. I'm not saying what we got was awful and unplayable though. I just felt like they tried to do too much because they had 8 acts this time. Although I'm pretty sure he's gonna come back, he's too big of a presence in the game to just go out like that. And if he doesn't come back, I think it was a pretty lackluster way to go for a villain like Dottore. He's been in the story of Genshin since the webtoon, literally since the beginning. He has impacted so many characters and so many storylines. It would be a shame for him to just be gone without really any proper resolution to any of the storylines that he affected. No resolution for Kale, Diluc, Nahida, and even the Wanderer. And if you remember all the way back in the Sumeru trailer, there's also that one clip of him burning down Irminsul. I don't think we've gone back to that yet. There's just still so much that they can do with Dottore, so I do hope that he comes back. Actually, I'm pretty sure this is just one segment of Dottore. There's just no way he's gone, right? Okay, I decided that I will talk a bit about Lauma, Flintz, and Nefer together because I do still want to talk about them and their role in the story, but I also don't have a ton of things to say. I think they each were integrated into the story relatively well. During the Archon quest, I felt like all 3 of them had an important role to play without it feeling too forced. During the Archon quest, I felt like all 3 of them had an important role to play without it feeling too forced. And I don't think that any of them were neglected like some unfortunate 5 5 stars in the past. Lauma was shown to be a very benevolent person, even to those who don't deserve it. However, she's not a doormat. She will actually stand up for herself and her people if needed. I think as early as Act 1 of Nod Krai, Lauma was already hinting that she won't just sit still if the Fatui kept harassing the Frostmoon Scions. She kinda low-key threatened them. She also has her own set of dilemmas that relate to the main story. She's one of the few people in the game that knows about the fake sky. She figured that out on her own, and the Traveler just confirmed this for her. And this does become a burden to her because she knows her people are all worshipping a fake moon that's part of the fake sky. But she does end up telling them the truth at the end. It's stated in her character story that lying is actually one of the most sinful things that a moon chanter can do, because the Frostmoon Scions will always take her word as truth. Hence why knowing the actual truth behind the false sky has been eating away at her. And what I really liked about the Nod Krai characters is just how they spent time in showing the pre-existing relationship between characters. We get so many moments of Nefer and Lauma's dynamic, Lauma and Flynn's, and Nefer and Yehuda. These pre-existing relationships being centered in the dialogues and showcased in the game is what I feel makes the world feel a lot more alive. It's actually crucial in making it seem like the characters have lives before, during, and after the quest. It's also what makes Nod Krai feel lived in. I think Genshin has always tried to integrate their characters into the world, but a lot of them never really got those moments within the main quest itself. The game tries to do this in story quests, however, they don't always do a good job when it comes to their own story quests, which is why I really like what they did with Nefer. Nefer is the owner of the Curatorium of Secrets, so when the game put her front and center in extracting information about Rare's past, I think it was a great way to utilize her character and her background. I really like that the Traveler doesn't necessarily play a role in this segment of the story. They just left the task to Nefer, who is the most equipped person to do so within the story itself. I also really think they did a good job in making her personality pretty consistent throughout the main quest, like how she acts with Lauma, Yehuda, and the others feel like mostly in character for her, even when she's making extreme decisions to take risks that might sacrifice her own well-being, like, you know, her vision. It says a lot about who she is as a person without the game having to explicitly say it to our faces. Flint is also a nice addition to the cast, I think because he's a lightkeeper and kind of lives in isolation. There's this expectation of him being edgy, especially with the way he looks. So it was pretty refreshing to see that he's incredibly polite, like even more polite than most characters. Overall, I really liked the new cast, and I do think the game did a pretty good job in giving them memorable moments and integration into the story, and I do hope that we'll see them again in future events. I think Nod Krai has been a pretty fun filler arc. Right before we get to Shishnaya, I had zero expectations of this nation, but we were given interesting and fun characters, an interesting and engaging story, and they actually wrapped up the story pretty nicely despite its flaws. And it does make me happy that the game seemed to have time to further establish a story that has been a part of the deeper lore for years. I think that can be very rewarding for players who have followed the lore really closely, and also just a nice surprise for players who are more casual. It's been a pretty good time overall. It was pretty balanced overall, especially considering how many characters were present in the story. It felt pretty refreshing, and yeah, let me know what you think of Nod Krai. I personally really enjoyed it. Let me know what you think of Columbina and Sandrone. All of that good stuff. I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you for watching all the way till the end. It means a lot to me. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already. If you don't want to, that's also fine. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.